I selected this topic, the macroeconomic framework of India. I have a reason to do that because these are very different times. The world, it's creating an unimaginable level of global crisis. It's like war, climate crisis, debt crisis, energy crisis. So we name it as polycrisis. And this polycrisis is a production of an expanding zone of new unknowns. We call it as radical uncertainties. So what could be the macroeconomic framework when we face the radical uncertainties? So that's what we need to look into. For instance, after the global financial crisis, when the world reached a Minsky moment, you know what is Minsky moment? In capitalism, we say the financial systems, that has an intrinsic instability in it. So the moment we experienced after the global financial crisis, that Minsky moment, the monetary policy framework was crucial. And the world was dealing with the monetary macro policy tools to deal with that Minsky moment. And we know that it didn't work. We didn't believe that time in the redominance of the public finance. But beyond a point, the monetary macro policy tools didn't work. Why I said this? You can recall that the interest rate, we kept it lower, and once it reached the liquidity, trap moment, then the monetary policy failed to trigger the global economic growth recovery process. So it was going even negative. So when monetary policy has got limited impact on the global growth recovery process, what could be that redominance of the public financial policy tools? That was the moment in which the world was looking into the redominance of the public financial management tools or the fiscal policy tools. Then we had a lot of public financial management reforms. We had stimulus packages, in that moment. But later on, we realized the importance of a proper fiscal policy and monetary policy coordination. Now, let's take the contemporary moment. This ongoing acceleration of the climate change crisis, that's actually exposing a humanitarian crisis. And we know the vulnerability of the food security systems. We know the vulnerability of the energy transition system. So what could be that macroeconomic framework India should be thinking to deal with this global crisis? So that's exactly what we need to look into this moment. And recently, I attended a meeting in ODI London. My former boss, Ratin Roy, you all know about Ratin Roy. He was the member of, Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. He was my boss. He was a director of NIPFP. So he invited me to he's a managing director of, ODI London. So he invited me for that conference, and that conference was an eye-opener moment for me. The Adam Tooze, the director of the European Institute in Columbia University, he was the professor who talked about this polycrisis moment for the first time so effectively. So whatever I have articulated right now, we can mold it into a term, polycrisis. So this polycrisis is what I articulated as in times of war, climate, debt crisis, energy crisis. It's like a multiple crisis, and we need to have a framework to deal with this multi-crisis or a polycrisis. Now let's look at the status quo. What is happening right now in India? Let's take up the public financial management part. Debt restructuring is a crucial component to deal with this polycrisis. And we are not facing a moment just like Pakistan or Sri Lanka just because we don't have a huge presence of donors in the debt market. We don't have huge external debt. So we are sound in terms of reducing the external debt over time. If you look into the financing pattern of deficit, we know that the internal deficit is huge, and we also have taken a transition from seigniorage financing, that is the RBI FDI through, this treasury bills and all financing the fiscal deficit. That is, in layman's term, it's like a printing of money and financing deficit. We have taken a lovely transition from seigniorage financing to the bond financing right now. Now, to face this energy crisis, what is the articulation? Within this financing pattern of the fiscal deficit, a thematic financing is articulated as climate bonds. And we need to say that the sovereign bonds, which is earmarked for tackling the green infrastructure or the climate energy crisis, if that is working or not, we need to wait and see. But that's the way we responded through the debt restructuring within the financing pattern of fiscal deficit. So that's the way we articulated. Now, coming to the bigger questions. The donors in the external, when the debt restructuring articulation, when that is happening around the world, donors, they tend to look into how much dollars are taken and how much dollars are repaid. To what extent you used it for the humanitarian cause or for, the non-productive cause doesn't matter. But in terms of repayment, it has to be at the right time and it has to be paid in dollars. That's the articulation of the external financial markets. But we need to take a relook into it and ask the question, fiscal space for what? We have to ask the question, what is the use of the debt we have taken from the market, internal or external? As long as the lenders are only interested in how much debt we are paying back, the context really matters. We don't mind about why you are using or what you are using the debt for. That will lead to a kind of transition in the expenditure design of any country. So that's the global concern right now, that the fiscal policy for what? That's a crucial question we need to rethink, rather than take the debt, repay the debt at the right time. Use of the debt, we don't we don't mind. We are not concerned at all. That's articulation. Now, among the global economists, Oliver Blanchard came up very vocally responding to this, and he came up with the proposition for this macro framework, like, if you have high debt, you need to articulate to reduce your output gaps. In the macroeconomic framework, this output gap is a crucial variable, and this output gap is also a controversial variable. In the sense, the output gap we measure as a gap between your potential output and actual output. It is measured in terms of, in the native economy, it is measured in terms of employment. But in the context of India, it is measured in terms of your potential output and actual output in terms of GDP. And we know that the GDP methodology, it has undergone a transition. There is data fundamentalism and there are data gaps. And these are, rolling into a crisis in which we created the debt numbers. And we are now arguing about the way we are floating the surveys, and the methodology is not correct. The sampling is not correct. But the reality is that most of the elements or the components that go into the GDP are extrapolated due to the lack of data. So that's the reality with the actual output. Now comes to the potential output. Potential output is unobserved variable. You need to create the potential by looking into the econometric methodology, and we use the filters. You look into the components of the cyclical and the the structural elements into it. You call the trend as your potential GDP by taking out the cyclicality. This is what we call as filters, using HP filter and Kalman filters. And now, is this macroeconomic framework working, which is based on the output gap? Because we are framing the policies, both the monetary policy and fiscal policy, based on this articulation of output gap. Then the policy makers, both the finance ministry and the central bank, they tend to form policies which are counter-cyclical in nature. But counter-cyclical policy making, whether it is monetary or fiscal, does it work? This is a question we need to ask, especially in the context of poly-crisis, because these are the crises which are created. It's not given. So we need to look into the tools which are required for tackling this poly-crisis, both from the fiscal and monetary policy perspective. And another, analytically, if you look into another reason why this output gap, that macroeconomic framework is not working, another reason is, we tend to believe in business cycles. And we tend to believe in business cycles even in the context of emerging economies, but that is not usually the case. And we have seen, particularly in front of our eyes, after the crisis, after the COVID crisis, in the post-pandemic strategies, these business cycles are not operating perfectly, and we need to look into the structural reforms, because the dating of the business cycles as high and low points, that doesn't work when the growth point which is plummeting from the early or the pre-pandemic or the pre-crisis moment may not be cyclical, so that your counter-cyclical policy in terms of fiscal or monetary will trigger the economic growth recovery process in the U-shape back to the pre-crisis levels. That's not working, because we need to look into the hysteresis when we talk about the economic growth recovery process, because these downturns in the economic growth is permanent scar. It's not just cyclical, so that you put a magic bullet like counter-cyclical fiscal or monetary policy tools and you get your growth recovery all right. So these are the concerns related to the macroeconomic policy framework when we look into the economic growth. Now, as Professor Shija mentioned, if this is the crisis, then what could be the instruments or the policy tools or the public policies we need to design to tackle with the crisis? So that's a question number 2. Now, debt restructuring I have highlighted. I have highlighted what Oliver Blanchard has proposed, that you have high deficit, that's fine, high debt, that's fine, use it for reducing your output gaps. Then again, output gap is controversial and you are unable to work with the output gap reductions, and that's not leading to the economic growth process recovery. Then the second magic bullet which emerging countries now tackling with is, let us focus on infrastructure, because infrastructure is a wonderful way of getting the growth recovery process all right. So the second articulation is that let it be the accommodative fiscal space, but you use it for infrastructure or the capex enhancement, whether that is working, because in India we have tried a lot of reforms. Not only in terms of the infrastructure, we believe that it is going to crowd in the private investment. We looked into many other structural reforms. Insolvency code is there. There are many other restructuring reforms we got into. But why the private investment is not picking up? Now everything else failed. So we need to see, and the overall macroeconomic uncertainties and the external uncertainties and the uncertainties in the global financial markets, that's affecting the private investors' confidence. All possible or plausible internal domestic measures we have taken to trigger, but the private investment is shy. That's mainly because the external uncertainties and the uncertainties in the global financial markets. Now that's a case. What is the articulation related to that? The global financial markets and the global monetary macro policies. Here, an important question is what the Western world is doing in terms of their monetary macro policies. Let us take, for instance, the US Fed. That's a center bank. And the US Fed chair, Jay Powell, is on a hawkish mode. And, when the Western world, especially the US, go into the hawkish mode, it has got its own repercussions into the emerging countries. And we clearly know that an only answer to these uncertainty is to have an interest rate defense mechanism. So how long we can do this interest defense or interest rate defense mechanism when that is going to affect the growth recovery process? Because you know that the interest rate defense by going hawkish is not working well with the economic growth recovery process. But if you look from the point of view of Jay Powell, the US Fed chair, he doesn't need to look into what's happening in the emerging economies, but that's by logic and by ethics. If you look into the process which should not lead to beggar thy neighbor, that's the ethical concern. Otherwise, technically and by mandate, he doesn't need to look into what's happening in the emerging world, because he is worried about his balance sheet and his interest rate regime. So, but how the emerging countries are trying to cope up with this? What is the macroeconomic tools or the framework designed within an emerging country, especially India, to tackle this crisis? So we have gone hawkish in our interest rate. And in recent MPC, the Monetary Policy Committee articulations, and for the freshers, I take a moment to say what is MPC. It is like the independence we seek in the monetary policy realm in the context of India is an operational independence, not a goal independence. In the sense, we focus on the operational independence by forming a committee with voting powers, that is the Monetary Policy Committee, and announce our monetary policy stance by the Monetary Policy Committee's decisions, rather than, RBI governor articulating that this is a monetary policy stance. So that's the operational independence, but we don't have a goal independence, because that goal, the price stability is a goal of the central bank across the world. Because we have moved to the inflation targeting, which is again failing. We need to ask the question why the inflation target is failing. And today also we have seen the articulation that the inflation is mounting, not from, the monetary policy variables, but from, the non-monetary policy variables like structural shocks, or if you have a monsoon failure, or if you have, the structural or the supply side shocks in the economy. Now, some disturbance. Are we okay? Okay, that's fine. Okay. Okay. Now, when we have this price stability, the prime concern of the monetary macro policies, and when we have this fiscal policy remaining accommodative by high deficit and high debt, there is a sense of internal inconsistency within the macro policy realm. In the sense, if you are keeping the interest rate high and if you want your fiscal policy to be accommodative, that's getting into the public debt management, and the public debt management is going costly. So right now, what we are doing is we work with the elongation of the maturity structure. Elongation of the maturity structure in the sense, we try to buy more long-term bonds and sell short-term bonds so that the refinancing risk is postponed and we get enough space to pitch the robust growth path. But is it working? We need to look into it. And it is not only the case of the central governments, this is also the case with the state governments. They are also grappling with the debt restructuring issues. And the subnational governments have more responsibility in the sense the fiscal rules are given to them. There is no fiscal space in the sense the fiscal policy rules are given to them. And there is a policy transition from discretionary space to the rules-based fiscal space and monetary space. In the sense, inflation targeting is a monetary space, and fiscal rules is the space, the rules-based, articulation in the finance ministry. So this is again related to the energy transition. Now we have to look back to the question of the climate resilience growth path. Then this fiscal consolidation or the fiscal rules within the macro policy framework articulated by the finance ministry is linked to energy transition. How? We have articulated that, of course, you have a deficit of 3.5, that's fine, instead of 3, which is the mandate. But this 0.5 needs to be linked to power sector reforms. And we know that in the just energy transition literature now that's mounting, and you know that the next month we have the COP28 in Dubai, and we need to focus on this fiscal and energy policy transition articulation. And there, this point 5 of extra borrowing space is linked to the power sector reforms. But the plight is, if you look into the efficiency parameters of the financial and operational efficiency parameters of the power sector, the state governments have not reached to a level in which they can confidently say that they have undertaken the power sector reforms. So that's a crisis. It is linked to the fiscal consolidation, and on the top of that we have the articulation of on-grid and off-grid energy infrastructure related issues. When we are having the deliberations with the energy transition group, there the issue is, when an emerging country like India, when we face the energy poverty issues, what kind of electric vehicle transition are we talking about? What kind of non-conventional energy transition are we talking about? Are these environmentally sustainable? These are the questions we need to ask. Overnight, we may get into a non-fossil world, but the policy prescription articulated by the countries in the G20 forums or in other G7 or in any multilateral forums, are we able to deliberate upon the sustainable energy transition? Are we able to articulate about our energy poverty issues? So these are the questions we need to look into and incorporate within the macro policy realm. So, in nutshell, the policy maker, whether you are working with finance ministry or whether you are working with central bank, things are not easy this time. So the policy makers around globe, they are grappling with lot of transitional issues, and they are inventing or they are going for some innovations to tackle these issues, and this is a tough moment for them. And on the top of that, to complicate the issues, the political economy context is also very crucial. Political economy context, as I mentioned earlier, it can be a polycrisis moment, and this is a time of war and other polycrisis. And on the top of that, within the type of the governance, whether it is democracy or whether it is authoritarian regime, the type of governance is also eating into the macro policy frameworks. So how do you tackle this political economy context? And as students, when you are working with the finance ministry, when you are working with the planning commission, planning board, when you are working with the subnational finance ministries, how to tackle this political economy moment, because that is very crucial, because it is linked to the budget credibility, it is linked to fiscal transparency and accountability issues. So these are also, from a practitioner's articulation, these are also very important to be looked into. Right now, we know that we are going to get into the elections. So when we look into the expenditure design, of course, the revenue stability is crucial. These are moments of revenue uncertainties. But when you look into the energy, when you look into the expenditure design, are we getting into a pre-electoral expenditure design? If you're getting into a pre-electoral expenditure design to woo your voters, what is the fiscal space? These are the articulations which is further complicating the technical macroeconomic framework. So on one side, the central bank, they are still keeping that professional, because political economy has not entered into central bank. They have the tools to deal with the crisis. The first tool, as I mentioned earlier, is the interest rate defense. The second tool is the liquidity guidance. They are doing that. And within the liquidity guidance in the priority sector lending, they're also incorporating the climate change related infrastructure. So that's fine. So far as I am concerned, the central bank is very technical. The political economy is not affecting them so far. But the question is, should we tell them to look into the political economic questions? Because this climate related crisis or the climate related risk and uncertainties in turn affect their technical financial stability issues. So unless they go political, they can't deal with these questions. But again, the counter articulation is that will affect the reputation risk of a central bank governor or a central bank chief. So if you look into central banks around the world, the polycrisis how that is tackled, especially when I talk about the poly crisis, why the energy crisis and the climate crisis is mounting, because of the importance given to these issues in the global forums, and we need to get to the net zero level to tackle the global energy crisis, and it is an international public good. As long as when the climate change is an international public good, we need to get this articulation at the global level deliberations. And you know that ECB has gone into this climate related issues incorporated within the monetary policy reaction function. Bank of England has started the stress test. So central banks are doing the greening of monetary policies. But on the other side, what exactly for the climate change the fiscal policy authorities are looking into? They are looking into, as I mentioned earlier, the climate bonds. They are looking into the articulation of IGFT, the intergovernmental fiscal transfers, incorporating an energy or the green variable. And we have 16th Finance Commission very soon. In November, it will be constituted. And what will be the articulation of this poly crisis within the IGFT framework, we need to look forward to. So, and to conclude, there is no silver bullet to tackle this crisis. Finance Ministry is in crisis and Central Bank is equally in crisis. And right now, the kind of agreement we have come up to is that let the fiscal policy be accommodative to deal with the growth recovery process. And we have seen the World Economic Outlook numbers that India is a shining spot or a sweet spot in the global realm in terms of the economic growth. But we should not be forgetting the fact that the growth rate can be little tricky. Why it is a sweet spot? Why our growth is showing high numbers? Because of the base effect. Because we have plummeted like anything in the crisis time. So from there, it may be to the next level or to the high level. But if you take a look into, the levels, then we need to really ask the question, are we facing a sweet spot moment or challenges are many? And what are the challenges? Inequalities, widening inequalities. So what are the policies we need to, articulate, or we need to, give emphasis to tackle this widening inequality is an important question. Because if you look into the benefit incidence analysis of the public expenditure, you can see that there is a distributional inequality when we talk about the redistributive justice in terms of the public expenditure commitments. So that's a crisis. And now, can we deal with this from the taxation side? International taxation is also going through a transitional phase, and we know the Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. Pillar 2 is looking into the global minimum tax for the corporate, and we have to reduce it to 15% so that we avoid this mobile capital getting into a tax war. So we are getting into this Pillar 2 when we talk about the international taxation. And heterodox economists are also speaking about the wealth tax. You tax the rich and you deal with the crisis, and rather than saying no to the expenditures which are relevant for reducing the inequalities. So these are the uncertainties, and I leave my lecture, my talk here with this, the moment of radical uncertainty around us. And we need to be a little cautious, and we need to invent new policy tools. And this is a moment to have a relook into the transitional fiscal policy and the monetary policies, not only at the national level, but also at the subnational levels. Thank you, and the floor is open for discussion. Thank you so much. I selected this topic, the macroeconomic framework of India. I have a reason to do that because these are very different times. The world, it's creating an unimaginable level of global crisis. It's like war, climate crisis, debt crisis, energy crisis. So we name it as poly crisis. And this poly crisis is a production of an expanding zone of new unknowns.